Nestled on the outskirts of a quiet suburban town was a neighborhood that looked like something out of a glossy magazine. The homes were picture-perfect, freshly painted, lawns manicured to the millimeter, and each yard meticulously decorated with just the right amount of flowers and bushes. The sun bathed the streets in a warm, welcoming glow, the perfect image of American dream living. But underneath a flawless surface, the veneer of tranquility was slowly being chipped away by something far less idyllic. The Homeowners Association, or HOA. The HOA, led by the iron-fisted Karen Wilson, had been a looming presence over the community for years. Karen, with her platinum blonde hair, always perfectly coiffed, her stiff posture, and her overly enthusiastic smile, had been the HOA president for as long as anyone could remember. She was the type of person who knew every rule by heart, from the height restrictions on fences to the exact color shade of acceptable paint for the houses. Nothing, and I mean nothing, escaped her scrutiny. I had lived in the neighborhood for 5 years now, and while I had mostly kept my head down and my lawn pristine, I was beginning to feel the pressure. The HOA had become more invasive over the years, imposing stricter regulations, demanding higher fees, and constantly reminding us of the rules. And Karen, she had grown worse. As president, she had become a self-appointed queen, wielding her power like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just the standard annoying HOA stuff anymore. It was the way she made arbitrary rules and levied fines for things that didn't even make sense. Your trash cans couldn't be visible from the street, even if they were tucked neatly behind your fence. If your grass grew a quarter-inch above the prescribed length, expect a fine in your mailbox. Heaven forbid your dog's leash extended beyond the sidewalk for even a moment. But what really made Karen a force to be reckoned with wasn't just her zealous enforcement of the rules, it was the way she seemed to thrive on power, on control. The neighborhood wasn't a community to her. It was her kingdom and the residents, her subjects. At the HOA meeting, one fateful Thursday evening, Karen made an announcement that would set everything into motion. As usual, the meeting took place at the community center, a bland windowless building tucked at the corner of the neighborhood. A few of the more enthusiastic residents gathered around the long table, while the rest of us sat back, watching the proceedings with varying levels of indifference. As the meeting dragged on, Karen's voice echoed with her usual energy, though it felt increasingly hollow. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone clipped but artificially upbeat, "I'm pleased to announce a new community project that will ensure we remain the best neighborhood in the area, one that is not only beautiful but sustainable." I shifted in my seat, exchanging skeptical glances with a few neighbors who seemed equally disinterested. Sustainable, in a place where every inch of property was scrutinized and perfected to within an inch of its life. I wasn't buying it, Karen continued. "We will be drilling for water right here, on our land, to provide a self-sustaining water system for the entire neighborhood. It's an investment in our future. We've been talking about this for months, and I'm proud to say that we've secured the permits to begin drilling next week. With this water system, we will reduce reliance on the city's utilities and, more importantly, save money on our water bills." A ripple of murmurs ran through the room, some in agreement, others with visible skepticism. I raised an eyebrow. Self-sustaining water for the whole neighborhood. It sounded great in theory, but it was a big, expensive undertaking. Who exactly was going to bear the brunt of the cost? Karen's eyes scanned the room, and she flashed a tight smile. "Don't worry, the cost will be spread out evenly among all of us. Of course, and think of the long-term benefits: no more rising water bills, no more dealing with utility company red tape. We'll have our own water supply, all thanks to our proactive leadership." I could feel my gut tightening. Something didn't sit right with me. As much as Karen liked to pat herself on the back for being the savior of the neighborhood, I knew her well enough to see through her polished rhetoric. She had always been a master manipulator, and this project had her fingerprints all over it. I wondered who was going to benefit from this water project more than the community itself. As the meeting drew to a close, Karen handed out brochures about the water drilling project, which included technical details that were completely above my head. But the promises were their lower water bills, greener lawns, and a thriving, sustainable neighborhood. Karen's handouts also included a fine print clause. Buried deep in the middle of the document, participation in the project is mandatory for all homeowners. The HOA will collect fees for the drilling and installation, with the first payment due within the next 30 days. I flipped the brochure over, my eyes narrowing. Fees. When had that been decided? The usual HOA fees were already high enough, and now we were supposed to pay for an unasked-for, large-scale water drilling operation. Despite my reservations, I kept quiet that evening. I was no stranger to the lengths Karen would go to maintain control, and I suspected this was just another power play. I decided I would take a closer look at the plans on my own and see if there was anything that didn't add up. But it wasn't until the drilling actually started that I realized how badly things could go wrong. The first signs that something was off with the water drilling project came within days of the initial announcement. Karen and the board had wasted no time. The drilling equipment was rolled in massive machines with colossal drilling arms. Long pipes and heavy-duty trucks lined the streets. Residents watched as the crew began setting up, clearing areas of common land that had once been open spaces for kids to play or for neighbors to chat over the fence. Despite the protests of a few concerned homeowners, Karen was relentless. The HOA held an emergency meeting to reassure everyone that the drilling was perfectly safe. Karen's presence at the meeting was as usual dominant, condescending, and smug. She made an effort to smile, but her eyes betrayed a deeper impatience. She didn't care about the community's concerns. She just wanted to push this project forward. The work will be done quickly, efficiently, Karen told the residents with her usual overconfidence. We are all in this together. Think of it as an investment in our collective future. This water system will save us all a lot of money in the long run. The problem was, none of her promises seemed to line up with the reality of what was happening. I began noticing small things that no one else seemed to question. For one, the drilling site was slowly expanding. What was supposed to be a single drilling operation in one corner of the communal land quickly spread across a larger area. The equipment was moved around, and the entire neighborhood felt like it was being dug up. The noise was relentless, a deep, throbbing hum that reverberated through the walls of my home. The vibrations were constant, almost nauseating, as if the very earth beneath us was being scraped raw. More troubling was the fact that Karen had promised we would be drilling down to tap into a natural water table that was supposedly nearby. But the further the drilling went, the more irregular it became. They had only given us the vaguest of details about the exact location of the water source. As the days passed, I started to realize there was no real transparency. What exactly were they drilling for? One afternoon, I decided to take a closer look at the site. I had a feeling Karen wasn't being entirely truthful. Walking down the street, I could feel the vibrations growing stronger as I neared the drilling site. The machines churned away, as though they were in a race to reach the Earth's core. A few workers were on site, but they barely looked up when I approached. Hey, I called to one of them, a middle-aged man who was leaning on a shovel. How deep are you drilling? Are you even close to hitting the water table yet? The man wiped his forehead, casting a sidelong glance at the machinery. Hard to say, he muttered, his voice low and reluctant. We've been hitting some odd layers of rock, so it's slowing things down. They didn't tell us much, but if it were me, I'd be a bit more cautious. Could be dangerous, you know? His comment caught me off guard. Dangerous? What do you mean? He looked over his shoulder as if checking for Karen or one of the board members before he leaned in a little closer. Well, there's more than just water down there. We've hit some gas pockets. No one said anything about drilling near old pipelines or anything like that. Doesn't sit right with me. But I'm just here to work, not ask questions. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Gas pockets. Old pipelines. What exactly had Karen gotten us into? That night, I spent hours researching drilling operations, pipelines, and any local history about the area that might explain the strange comments I had overheard. The more I looked, the more the whole project seemed shrouded in mystery. There had been no public consultation on the specifics of the drilling operation, and no one had disclosed any potential environmental hazards. Worse yet, there were no experts in water management or geology overseeing the project, just a handful of construction workers, hired by a company with loose ties to Karen's friends. It seemed too much like a backdoor deal. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to speak with a few other homeowners who might have noticed the same oddities, to see if they were as concerned as I was. It didn't take long for my suspicions to be confirmed. A few residents had noticed cracks in their walls, their windows rattling from the incessant drilling. Others were seeing strange leaks in their basements, as if the ground itself was shifting beneath their homes. The vibrations were strong enough that several fences had buckled, and some yards were starting to sink. That evening, I met with a few of the neighbors in the local park. We sat on the benches, whispering, not wanting Karen's ever-watchful eye to catch us conspiring. This whole thing smells fishy, said Dan, who had lived in the neighborhood for almost 20 years. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I don't think they're drilling for water like they say. If you've seen the equipment, it looks like they're trying to tap into something else. I overheard a guy on the crew. I said, my voice low. He mentioned gas pockets and old pipelines. He seemed concerned, like they're drilling in an area they shouldn't be. That explains the cracks in my house, said Laura, another neighbor, her voice tinged with frustration. I thought it was just the foundation settling, but now I'm not so sure. What if this drilling is causing it? We need to stop this before it gets worse, I said, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on me. The HOA had long since crossed the line, but now it was threatening our safety. The next step was obvious, but daunting. We had to take action, but who would listen? Who could help us stop this madness? The following days were a whirlwind of research, phone calls to experts, and visits to the town's building department. What I discovered was both terrifying and enlightening. Karen had pushed through the permits for the drilling with minimal scrutiny, and the more I dug, the more I realized this project wasn't just flawed. It was a ticking time bomb. The more I learned, the more I understood that the HOA was hiding something far worse than just bad planning. The question was, how deep did the lies go? And how far would I have to go to uncover the truth? By the time the drilling crew reached the deeper layers of the earth, the entire neighborhood was on edge. The ground seemed to rumble beneath us every day. and the constant vibration was starting to take its toll on everything from the houses to the trees. Fences were sagging, windows cracked, and more residents were reporting strange, undiagnosable smells like gas or sulfur seeping through their walls. Karen, of course, dismissed all of it with a wave of her hand. "Nothing to worry about, folks," she would say with that too-perfect smile of hers. "A little noise, a little shake, and it'll all be over soon. We're creating a better future here, people." But something inside me told me that the more she downplayed the situation, the worse it was getting. I spent my nights scouring through old property records, talking to old-timers in the neighborhood, and even consulting a geologist who confirmed my worst fears. There was an old pipeline running beneath the area. It wasn't a gas line, at least, not the kind Karen might have anticipated. This one carried industrial waste and natural gas, byproducts, highly flammable materials that were incredibly volatile if disturbed. As the days went on, the noises from the drilling became more erratic, sharper, like the sound of metal grinding against rock. But Karen refused to halt the drilling, refusing to entertain the thought that something had gone horribly wrong. She insisted that everything was fine, that the neighborhood was merely experiencing growing pains on its way to a better future. It wasn't long before I found myself unable to stand by and watch anymore. The warning signs had been ignored for weeks, and it was clear that Karen and the board had no intention of stopping. I had to act before it was too late. I reached out to the local media, hoping that public pressure would be enough to force Karen's hand. But, like everything else in the neighborhood, the HOA had its claws in the local government too. The town's safety officers shrugged off my concerns, and even when I presented the geologist's report, they claimed there was nothing they could do until an actual disaster happened. Then, it happened. One Tuesday afternoon, the ground literally exploded. I had just gotten home from work when I heard a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't the usual rumble of the drilling equipment. This was a deep, resonating boom that shook the ground beneath me. The windows rattled, and my walls felt like they were going to collapse. My first thought was that there had been an earthquake, but then the smell hit me. A sharp, acrid stench of burning rubber and something else. Something metallic. Chemical. I rushed outside, along with my neighbors. At first, we couldn't see where it was coming from, but then a thick plume of black smoke rose up into the sky, darkening the daylight. It looked like a mushroom cloud of destruction, a symbol of everything gone wrong. I could hear distant shouting, followed by the sounds of sirens racing toward the disaster. I sprinted toward the source, my heart hammering in my chest. As I rounded the corner, I saw it. The drilling site had erupted in a violent explosion, sending debris flying in all directions. The drill itself had been thrown several feet into the air, landing with a sickening thud. The fireball that had followed was a mix of orange and black, crackling and popping with a terrifying intensity. The ground around the drilling site was scorched, and nearby homes had their windows shattered from the blast. Karen's voice echoed in my mind, that too-perfect smile never leaving her face. "Nothing to worry about, folks," she had said. But here we were. The neighborhood was under siege by an explosion of her own making. I couldn't breathe. My feet felt like they were stuck to the pavement, my body frozen in disbelief. This was it, the thing I had feared but couldn't fully grasp had finally happened. The drilling had disturbed the old pipeline, triggering a massive explosion. The pipeline, which Karen had never once mentioned, was now a danger to all of us. Within moments, firefighters arrived on the scene, their trucks screeching to a halt as they rushed to control the fire. Emergency responders quickly began evacuating people from their homes, checking for injuries, and containing the damage. But the damage was already done. The explosion had destroyed part of the street, setting fire to several houses, and left a significant scar in the land where the drilling had occurred. The fire had even started to spread toward some of the nearby properties. I stood at the perimeter with a few of my neighbors, unable to look away. My hands were shaking, my stomach twisting in knots. What had Karen done? The explosion wasn't just an accident, it was the culmination of weeks of negligence and greed. In her rush to build a water system that no one asked for, Karen had put us all in harm's way. The pipeline she had unknowingly or perhaps knowingly hit was carrying volatile materials, and now our community was paying the price. By evening, the news crews arrived. The explosion was too big to ignore, and the fire, though contained, was still smoldering in places. Reporters hovered around the edges of the scene, interviewing firefighters and officials, while Karen, of course, was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the next morning that she made her first public appearance. Stiffly, like a queen taking her throne after a storm, she stood in front of a crowd of reporters and homeowners who were still reeling from the shock of what had happened. Her face was pale, her smile strained. "We are devastated by the explosion," Karen began, her voice soft and controlled, though it faltered just slightly. "Our thoughts are with the families affected by this tragedy. We'll do everything we can to rebuild, and we will take full responsibility for the damage caused." I had heard enough. "You took responsibility," I yelled from the back of the crowd, pushing my way forward. "Karen, you had no idea what you were doing. You didn't even tell us there was a pipeline under our feet. You endangered every single one of us for a water project we never asked for." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others too stunned to speak. Karen's smile faltered for the briefest moment, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the guilt she had been trying so desperately to hide. We followed all the appropriate guidelines," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "There's no need to panic. The situation is under control." "No," I retorted, shaking my head. "It's not under control. You've put us all at risk for your little project, and now we're paying the price." That was the moment everything changed. No longer could she feign ignorance. No longer could she hide behind her position or her power. The truth had been revealed, and it was a devastating truth. The community had been betrayed. The aftermath of the explosion left the neighborhood in disarray. Firefighters, police officers, and emergency response teams were still picking through the debris, assessing the damage, and ensuring that no one was trapped under the rubble. The air smelled of burnt wood, melting plastic, and something heavier, something metallic, that hinted at the deadly materials in the pipeline. It was a smell I would never forget, but as the smoke cleared, so did the veil of complacency that had allowed Karen and the HOA to rule unchecked for so long. The neighborhood was no longer just angry, it was furious. What had been a quiet community was now a battleground, and at its center was Karen, who had made a disastrous misstep. I didn't waste any time. By the next morning, I had already started gathering evidence, sold contracts, permits, and documents that Karen and the HOA had carefully avoided sharing with us. If Karen thought she could brush this off with a few empty words of apology, she was wrong. I wasn't the only one pushing back. The explosion had unified the community in a way nothing else had. People who had once been passive, who had quietly endured Karen's petty rules, were now coming forward with their own stories. From cracked foundations to destroyed homes, 2 fines for perfectly reasonable complaints that had been thrown out by the HOA. It seemed like everyone had a grievance. One of the neighbors, Don, had spent hours going over the same legal documents I had found. He pulled out a small stack of notes and showed me the glaring discrepancies in the permits Karen had acquired. There was no record of any environmental impact assessment despite the fact that the area was built on top of a known gas line. No one had checked whether it was safe to drill there. Karen had skipped the necessary steps in favor of pushing the project through as quickly as possible. In fact, the drilling itself had been poorly supervised, and the crew was undertrained for a job of this scale. Dan and I both agreed. Karen had cut corners everywhere, hoping no one would notice until it was too late. It wasn't long before the legal battles began. I filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA, naming Karen and the board members as defendants. The charges: negligence, endangerment, and outright fraud. Karen had led us all into a disaster, and it was time she paid the price. The community's collective anger had turned into a force of its own, a legal tidal wave that would crash over Karen's empire of deceit. As the weeks passed, I organized meetings, bringing together as many homeowners as I could to discuss our next steps. We were not just looking for monetary compensation for damages, though that was certainly part of it, but for a complete overhaul of the HOA system. We wanted accountability. We wanted power back in the hands of the residents, not the board that had destroyed our peace of mind. The neighborhood was ready for a change. Meanwhile, Karen was doing everything she could to save her own skin. Her once pristine reputation was in tatters. The news outlets were all over the story, and the spotlight on the HOA's incompetence was impossible to escape. In a desperate move, Karen hired a high-powered law firm to try to shut down the lawsuits, claiming that the explosion was an accident and that the HOA had followed all legal protocols. She even tried to rally the remaining board members to publicly support her, but it was clear that their loyalty was wearing thin. Some of them had started to distance themselves from her, realizing that the public backlash was only growing stronger. It was during one of these public meetings that the final straw came. Karen appeared before a room full of irate residents. Her once perfect hair, now a little more frazzled, her usual smile replaced with a forced grimace. The meeting was packed, with reporters standing at the back, cameras poised. I took my place near the front, watching her every move. "I know the explosion was a tragic event," Karen began, her voice faltering slightly, "but we have to remember that the HOA was acting in good faith. We believed in this project. We thought it would benefit all of us. Enough." I couldn't help it. I stood up and interrupted her. "You've been lying to us from the start, Karen. You didn't care about the community. You didn't care about anyone but yourself. This wasn't about saving money or helping people. It was about you and your friends making a profit off of us." The room erupted into applause, the audience clearly in agreement. Karen's face turned pale as she glanced at the few remaining board members who were still sitting beside her. They, too, were looking uncomfortable. Their one solid support had cracked, and the power had shifted. A few weeks later, a grand jury convened to review the situation. The evidence we had gathered, along with the testimony of several construction workers, experts, and affected homeowners, was damning. The pipeline incident was not an isolated error, but the result of a series of illegal actions taken by Karen and her cronies. The permits had been manipulated, the safety regulations ignored, and the project had been rushed through for personal gain. There was no denying it. Karen had placed the entire community at risk, and now she was facing the consequences. The legal proceedings were long and drawn out, but in the end, Karen and the board were found guilty of multiple charges. The HOA was disbanded, and the entire leadership was forced to resign. Karen was slapped with hefty fines, and she faced criminal charges for reckless endangerment. The destruction she had caused wasn't just physical, it had fractured the trust in the neighborhood, and it would take years to rebuild. What she had torn apart? But perhaps the most satisfying part was the compensation we received. The lawsuit not only ensured that the victims of the explosion would receive funds to repair their homes, but it also forced the city to implement stricter regulations on HOA activities moving forward. No one would be allowed to make decisions behind closed doors again, and the community would have more oversight than ever before. As for Karen, she was left with nothing but a ruined reputation and a mountain of debt. The money she had hoped to pocket from the project was gone, and her political and social influence had evaporated overnight. The once invincible Karen had been brought to her knees by the very people she had tried to control. In the end, justice was served. The neighborhood began to heal, and the new HOA this time, one that actually served the community's best interests, took root. I had done what I set out to do. Not only had I exposed Karen's corruption, but I had helped the community reclaim its power. It wasn't just about the lawsuit or the victory, it was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could exploit the people around them without consequences. And as I stood in front of my house, watching the sun set over the repaired fences and fresh lawns, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't about getting even, it's about making things right.